Bye.
Earlier this week, world leaders attending the G8 conference in Japan wrapped up a day of discussion on economic issues. Now, they agreed that although they were very concerned over rising prices in commodities worldwide, they said they were optimistic for recovery. Meanwhile, both major U.S. presidential candidates are slugging it out this week over the best way to jumpstart the economy. Thank you for joining us. I'm Elliot Francis. We are talking about the economy today with our guests, Michael Fletcher. Michael is a staff writer for The Washington Post. Also here is Jared Bernstein. Jared is a senior analyst for the Economic Policy Institute. I want to thank you, gentlemen, both for joining us here on American Dream tonight. Also want to mention, too, that Jared is the author of this book that we hold right here. It's called Crunch. Why Do I Feel So Squeezed? Book just came out not too long.
A couple months ago.
A couple months ago. Tell me about it. Crunch. Why do I feel so squeezed?
Well, that's exactly it. The book is actually a response to lots of the kinds of questions that I get, and I know Michael gets too, when we go around and try to understand the economy and understand what people are thinking about the economy. And in this book, I tried to decompose, really take apart what it is that's squeezing people in this economy, in an economy that by many statistics, if you kind of look at it from 40,000 feet up, looks real good. But you get down to ground level and people are having all kinds of problems. So in the short term, of course, there's a lot to be said about gas prices, food prices. We're into something that looks much like a recession. But in the longer term, the heart of this crunch is precisely that gap where the economy grows, but the people in the economy see far too little of that growth. And that's really the heart of the book.
Really, we were talking about this before we went on air here, because we show you some reactions that we had from some of the folks here in Washington just a little bit later. But for the most part, folks don't have a real good understanding, I think, of what is happening to them, or do they? All I know is my gas is higher, and I want you to fix it.
That's kind of interesting. I think people actually have a good intuitive sense of what's happening to them. Jared talks about kind of the bird's eye view of the economy being very good until maybe the last 8 or 9 months. And I spent years covering the Bush White House, and the gap always came up. You do public opinion polls, and people felt very anxious about the economy. Yet when you looked at the top line numbers, the economy looked pretty good. Overall, the economy was growing. There was pretty robust growth. But as Jared points out, people weren't feeling that gain in their pockets. Then you look back, people now say that this recovery, long as it was kind of what they call a jobless recovery. I mean, job growth was very low. Wages were stagnant for most workers. The wage gap was growing. And people couldn't maybe disaggregate all of that and tell you about that, but yet I think they felt that. Fewer people have pensions. People feel squeezed. People are carrying a little more debt than they're comfortable with. So people's lifestyles look good. I mean, people are still driving nice cars, moving to bigger homes, but I think they felt like they were in a more precarious place.
Yeah. Well, what do you think the tipping point was when people actually began to feel squeezed? Was it at the gas pump? Was it the housing crisis?
Well, it's an interesting thing, Elliot, because when you talk about today's economy, you almost can't talk about people because the word encompasses too many different people's experience. There are people who have done very well in this economy over the past 8 years, a relatively small sliver, and then there are people who have done very poorly, and then there are people in the middle who have slogged through. So really, how you're doing in this economy depends on your occupation. It depends on your level of education. It depends on how many poker chips you bring when you sit down at the table. Because some of those folks who sat down with really high stacks of chips have done fantastically, able to kind of leverage the globalization in a way that has hugely enriched them, while lots of other folks, and I would actually say it's the broad middle class, because the crunch or the squeeze is very much a middle class squeeze, have been struggling and stagnating now in terms of their income for a while. Let me just throw one statistic at you, and I don't want to bury us under a pile of numbers here, but this one is such an important, I think, point regarding what we're talking about. typically in a business cycle expansion, as when the economy is growing, which it is most of the time. Usually it's growing. Right now, maybe contracting, but typically the economy is growing. And when the economy grows, the income of the typical or median family, the family right in the middle of the income scale, tends to also grow. But in this business cycle, which lasted from about 2000 to probably the end of 2007, we don't know that, but that's what it looks like. The income, in real terms, adjusting for inflation, of the median family is actually lower now than it was in 2000. Now, that's the first time that's the first time that's ever happened, that the middle-income family failed to regain its prior economic peak. And this is in the context, as Michael has been saying, of an economic recovery that was productivity-rich, where the American workforce was working harder, smarter, longer, more efficiently, demonstrably more efficiently. Look at the numbers, yet just sharing in far too little of the gains.
Yeah. Are we starting to lose? We've heard talk, you mentioned the middle class, that in fact this economic situation is starting to erase the middle class. We've only got up here and down here and in here. It's just completely disappearing. Do you find that?
I don't think we've quite reached that point, but I think the people who are in the middle, and I think most Americans would fit in the middle somewhere, are as Jared said, use that word again, they're feeling more squeezed than ever, and they have to work harder to maintain their status. But still, I mean, people are middle class, I would venture to say, but I think the middle class, by many measures, is less secure than it was, even if it's more affluent in other ways, if that's not a contradiction. I mean, people are living well on par, but they're struggling hard, and they're worried about losing it. And there's more income volatility, as they talk about. People go up and down more. The falls are steep when people fall off, and then people are walking kind of a narrower road in the middle class, it feels like.
There are odd things happening, too, and I think those are the indicators that really tell people there's something hard happening here. And it goes beyond gas prices. I mean, my wife came home the other day, and she said, and I'd heard this from one other person since then, she says, you know what, I'm getting the same kind of food, the same brand of food, the same thing I get every week, but instead of spending $55, I'm spending $100.
Yeah.
It's what? What's going on here?
Well, it's called inflation, but it's inflation that we haven't seen for a while, and it's a really interesting thing. Your wife, my wife, me, we are facing prices that we simply haven't faced, particularly in the area of gas and food, really ever. I mean, the price of a gallon of gas has now surpassed its all-time high, adjusting for inflation. And so kind of a perfect storm right now, and it's interesting because thus far in the conversation we've been talking about long-term trends, medium-term trends. This is a very short-term trend in the sense that these gas prices have really caught people's attention, I would say. I mean, they've been rising for a while, but they really caught people's attention over the past 6 to 8 months, to the point where we are now seeing for the first time, by the numbers I'm looking at, for the first time really in maybe 30 years, people seriously changing their driving behavior. I mean, people are driving a lot less now than they were a year ago. And if you look at a plot of miles driven, you just see it just climbs up a mountain. And about 6 or 8 months ago, it hits a peak and it starts reversing. And it's a really amazing trend. Now, you can look at that reversal and say, in a way, that's great. People are conserving. But you also, I see in that reversal, some serious pain, because people aren't driving less because they want to necessarily. It's because they have to.
Absolutely. I mean, look at we've got communities now out in the Midwest and out west that are actually legalizing golf carts for use on city streets. Just add that the flag up in the air so that taller cars can see you, and yes, you can drive that.
But Jared points out there may be some good to this, and it really, if you look back, we actually went through a pretty remarkable period overall when it comes to inflation, particularly in something like food. Food had been cheap for a long time. Relatively speaking, gasoline was inexpensive in this country. And just goes to show you how the economy, how economics kind of drive our behavior. Even though we knew from the gas shocks back in the 70s that we should be preparing for this day, but there was no incentive. We were buying SUVs as a country, driving the big Suburbans, and now I think there's sort of a change in behavior that's being forced on us. We're moving to far out suburbs, and now you see people rethinking that. You see that with some of the housing crisis stuff. Like some of the biggest losses in valuation are in these far out communities where people have these big homes that carry big utility bills. And now that's an expensive proposition to live far out, having to drive that far, maybe driving your SUV, 20, 25 miles to work. I mean, that is a significant tax.
Just let go. This family right here just let go of a big SUV just this past weekend.
Congratulations.
Yeah, well, thank you. Just under the wire, too. They said if we